Hi, I'm Amy, and this is your sewing room solution. Today we're going to be doing our satin stitch, the difference between a zigzag and a satin stitch. Now some machines have a pre-programmed satin stitch, which is really much nicer than a zigzag that you manipulate yourself. A manipulated zigzag is when you actually shrink the stitch length and the stitch width and change the tensions to get it real nice and close and satiny and silky looking to do a beautiful applique. Now some machines have a pre-programmed satin stitch, which means when you select a satin stitch, the stitch length and stitch width and the tensions have already been pre-selected. Now the biggest difference is on a pre-selected satin stitch is the stitches are perfectly formed left and right. And on a regular satin stitch, it's just a shrunken zigzag, which means the stitches are off-formed just a little bit as the sewing machine moves. And I'm going to show you the difference between the two. To get a perfectly good satin stitch when you do any kind of applique, the first thing you have to use is stabilizer. Some sort of non-woven, tear-away, paper, non-porous stabilizer, and that's what it's called. When you go to the store, it's called tear-away stabilizer underneath your project, because when you're doing a satin stitch that zigzags, it has a tendency to pull the fabric up underneath and you get this tunneled mess, and nobody wants that. The most important, except for the stabilizer, is what type of presser foot to use. You have a couple different choices. The first thing you think of is, well, I have an all-purpose foot. It's the one I use all the time on my sewing machine. Why not that one? That's because it's flat on the back and there's no room for these heavy stitches. The second would be your applique foot. It has lots of room underneath, a little tunnel to let those satin stitches slide right underneath. But it's kind of hard to see. This one's a little clear, but my favorite is called an open toe satin stitch or open toe applique foot. There's nothing obstructing the view, so you can watch your needle on top of your fabric fall exactly where you want it to go. So it's very easy to find a pattern. So this is the foot I'm going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and snap it on here. Just snap it right into place and get it. Now the first stitch I'm going to show you is a regular zigzag. No big deal. We're just going to select it just like your regular sewing machine. Everybody has one. The stitch has been around for a million zillion years. No harm in that. Now you can, if you have a computer assisted machine or a computerized machine, you can adjust the stitch width even while you sew, which means you can make it wider. Most sewing machines go to 5 millimeters. The newer ones go all the way to 7 millimeters, which is amazing. We usually don't have things that wide. And you can see how cool this is. You can see it goes narrow and it gets wider and it gets wider and it gets wider all the way to 7 millimeters. Now the thread that I'm using is a Rayon embroidery thread. And even though you don't have an embroidery machine, you no reason why you can't own some of these threads, because Rayon is a little heavier. It is a 45 weight thread. Regular sewing weight's 50 weight, if that puts it in perspective. It's shinier, it's thicker, it's silkier, and just a little bit sexier. So it makes things shiny and pretty, and your applique really stand out. So you can see with the zigzag, it's a little offset. Now if I take this and shrink it, and I mean shrink it by shortening my stitch length right now is at 1.4. I'm going to take it all the way down to 0.2. We'll go dangerous. The smaller the number, the closer the stitching is going to be. And yes, you can make it so close that this thing's just going to sit and tie a knot and be a mess. The closer your stitch length, the slower the machine is going to move the fabric, and it could sit there and just make a ball, and you know it's too close, so you just have to lengthen it, and it's going to take a lot longer to sew. So we're just going to let this guy go. Now my tension is at 4.0. I'm going to reduce my tension to at least 3.0, if not 2.8. And what that does is it lets the rayon fabric relax and get pulled to the back so you don't see any of my bobbin thread. And that's what you want. You want that bobbin thread to pull the top thread to the back. So all you see is the pretty thread. Ooh, look how beautiful that is. You can see how pretty and satiny that is. That's just like if you just went to Neiman Marcus and just pulled it right off the shelf. So when I turn this to the back, you can see that was my tension at 4, and it only sees a little bit of the decorative thread. This is my tension at 2. You see a lot more of the decorative thread, and that's what I want to see. I want to see more decorative thread on the back. There's nothing worse than turning a corner and then have the bobbin thread pull up. So the bobbin thread, I try to match pretty similar with a bobbin weight thread or regular sewing thread. I don't use the same weight thread. I don't use the rayon thread in my bobbin when I do any kind of applique. Just a waste of thread. So how cool is that? Now I'm going to do the challenge, and I'm going to select a pre-programmed in satin stitch, and we're going to compare them side by side. Let's go to my menu here and select my pre-programmed. Now I'm going to make them the same width, so it's in all fairness. Now it automatically adjusted my tension to 2.8, and it took my length just to 1.0, so it probably isn't going to be as close, but I can always adjust that because I'm in control. It's more than I can say with the rest of my family. I'm in control of my sewing machine. It's about the only thing I have control of. And you can see I'm not pushing, I'm not pulling, I'm letting the sewing machine do all the work. That's why those feed teeth are so important. Now halfway through here, I'm going to go ahead and adjust my length. Down to Joe, there it sits still. Okay, lesson learned. Oh, there we go. Let's make it 0.4. I guess this is what I'm about, is learning lessons. Sometimes we can push too many buttons and make too many mistakes. Even though the machine does everything for us, we still want to touch all the buttons. Okay, you can see how even though this was pre-programmed in, it didn't quite look as nice as when I made the satin stitching real tight, and you can see here where I played it. But when I turn it over and look at the back, you can see it really reduced the tensions a lot more than when I did it when it wasn't pre-programmed in. So lesson learned is I like the pre-programmed applique. I just need to make the stitches a little bit closer, but that's why they give you the chance to adjust everything. So I had the perfect foot on. Now if I try to do this stitch right here with my all-purpose straight stitch foot on, there's no way that would move underneath that foot, and I would just have a mess. So many times we get frustrated because we're just using the wrong foot with the wrong stitch. So that's something to be concerned about. So it's always in your book, and believe it or not, you can crack those books open and read. That's why they pack them in with your sewing machines. But if you have any questions, I'm sure someone at your sewing machine dealer can tell you exactly what foot to use with the right stitch. And there's always a stitch on there that's adjustable. Some aren't adjustable, but there's always two purposes, two stitches with the same purpose that have two different uses for them. The zigzag is utility, and the pre-programmed satin stitch is awful pretty. And this is your sewing room solution.